Tessa Vance slammed the stack of reports onto the conference table so hard the room went silent. "If you're going to publicly humiliate everyone on this team, Mr. Klein, at least have the decency to read the numbers correctly," she snapped, arms crossed, chin high. "That drop in sales wasn't from my department. It came from your overpriced ad campaign that flopped." Across the sleek glass table, her boss Harold Klein went pale, his mouth twitching with rage. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. No one breathed, no one dared to look up. Except one man standing quietly in the back corner, Soren Beck. He hadn't planned on sitting in on the marketing team's meeting. He'd come to the New York headquarters for a quick walkthrough before heading to a charity gala uptown. But the moment he'd stepped into the hallway and heard raised voices, he lingered. Something about the fire in the woman's voice had stopped him cold. And now, watching her stand there, fearless, calling out a man twice her age and 3 levels above her, he couldn't look away. Harold tried to recover. "That's enough, Tessa, you're out of line." "No," she said, her voice steady. "I'm just tired of watching you blame other people for your mistakes." Soren's brow lifted. Who was this woman? Her hair was loosely tied back, strands falling around her face, and her blazer was a little too big on her, like it wasn't hers. But her eyes, sharp, unwavering, full of fire, made her unforgettable. "Meeting adjourned," Harold barked, grabbing his tablet and storming out. The others shuffled out behind him, avoiding eye contact as they left. Tessa stayed behind, still breathing hard. She looked down at the reports, then sighed and began gathering them up. Alone now, she didn't notice the tall man approaching until his shadow fell across the table. "You're either very brave," he said, "or completely insane." She spun around, startled. "Excuse me?" Soren held out his hand. "Soren Beck," she blinked. "Wait, the Soren Beck, as in Beck and Harrow Capital," he gave a small nod. "That's the one." Tessa immediately straightened. I didn't realize you were here." "Clearly," he said, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "You weren't exactly holding back," she flushed. "I'm sorry, that wasn't professional. I probably just committed career suicide." "No," he said, "you just made my week." She stared at him, stunned. He looked nothing like what she imagined a millionaire investor would. No stuffy suit, no cold demeanor. He was effortlessly put together in a dark, tailored coat and charcoal shirt, but his smile was warm. Disarming. "I've sat through 100 meetings this month," he said. "Not one person had the guts to speak like that. You were the only one willing to call out the truth." Tessa hesitated, unsure what to say. "Well, thank you," he tilted his head. "What's your name?" Tessa Vance." He nodded slowly, as if committing it to memory. "I'll see you around, Tessa." And just like that, he walked out. She stood there, stunned. What just happened? Tessa didn't expect to see him again. But 3 days later, he was waiting at the coffee cart outside her building. "You're avoiding the cafeteria," he said, handing her a cup. "How do you know that?" I asked, he said simply, "and bribed the barista to tell me when you showed up." She laughed softly. "That's a little intense." "I'm a little intense," he replied, sipping his own coffee. "Walk with me." They strolled through the plaza. She was still in shock. He was a millionaire, no, a multimillionaire, and yet here he was, casually walking with her like they were old friends. "Why are you talking to me?" she finally asked. He turned to her. "Because I can't stop thinking about you," her breath caught. "I watched you stand in a room full of scared people and say exactly what needed to be said," he continued. "That kind of honesty, that kind of fire, it's rare, and I'd be an idiot to ignore it." Tessa looked away, heart racing. "You don't even know me." "Then let me change that." He stopped in front of a black luxury SUV, the kind of vehicle that looked like it came with a private chauffeur and a bottle of champagne inside. "Let me take you to dinner." She blinked. "Right now." He opened the car door. "Right now." Dinner was at her rooftop restaurant in Tribeca, the kind that didn't have prices on the menu. A string quartet played in the corner, and the city lights glittered below them. Tessa had never felt so out of place, and yet, not once did Soren make her feel small. He asked about her life, her childhood, her dreams. He listened. And when she talked about her late father and how she'd worked 2 jobs to put herself through school, he didn't pity her. He respected her. "I've been in rooms with CEOs and politicians," he said, pouring her a glass of wine. "None of them have half your heart." She looked at him, dazed. "Why are you doing this?" "Because something happened the moment I saw you in that room," he said, looking her in the eyes. "I can't explain it, but when you spoke up, something in me shifted." "I'm not letting that go." Tessa's heart pounded. It was too fast, too much. But when he reached across the table and took her hand, she didn't pull away. In the days that followed, Soren kept showing up waiting outside her building, sending her lunch when she had back-to-back meetings, even walking her home when she worked late. He never pushed, he just showed up. And slowly, she let herself fall. One evening, after a long day, he brought her to a quiet art gallery he'd rented out just for them. It was filled with candlelight, music playing softly in the background. "You did all this," she whispered. He nodded. "You told me once you used to paint, but stopped when your dad got sick. I wanted to bring you somewhere that reminded you of the girl who dreamed big." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why are you like this?" "Because I think I'm falling in love with you," he said quietly. "And I don't want to waste any time." She froze. But then she whispered, "So am I." And when he kissed her, it didn't feel rushed. It felt like something inevitable, like something that had been waiting to happen for a very long time. Neither of them knew where this would go. But in that moment, under warm lights and soft music, they both knew one thing: they were in this. All the way, Tessa stood in front of the elevator, watching the floor numbers light up one by one. Her reflection in the brushed metal doors showed a woman who barely recognized herself, hair swept into a sleek twist, delicate gold earrings brushing her neck, and a fitted navy dress that looked like it belonged in a Vogue editorial rather than her modest closet. She hadn't chosen it. Soren had it delivered hours ago, boxed in tissue with a handwritten note that simply said, "Wear this tonight, I have a surprise." The doors opened to the penthouse. She stepped out slowly, and then froze. The entire rooftop had been transformed. Rows of soft lanterns hovered in the air like suspended stars. A long table stretched across the terrace, covered in pale linen and flickering candles. But what drew her attention was the view: New York City sprawling endlessly below, its lights stretching into forever. Soren stood near the edge, speaking quietly to a man in a crisp tuxedo. When he turned and saw her, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her like she was something rare, something he'd found after searching far too long. "I didn't know rooftops could look like fairy tales," she said, stepping toward him. "I didn't know I could still be surprised by someone," he replied. She smiled, but there was something under the surface, something taut in her chest that hadn't loosened since she got his message that morning. A single line: "Tonight changes everything." They sat at the table. A violinist began to play somewhere behind them. The food arrived in courses that looked like artwork, served by staff who moved with silent grace. But Tessa barely tasted any of it. She set down her fork. "Soren, what is this?" He leaned back, folding his hands together. "This is me doing something I've never done before." She tilted her head. "Which is taking a risk that isn't calculated." Tessa laughed uneasily. "You taking uncalculated risks. That doesn't sound like your brand." "I didn't plan for you, Tessa. I didn't plan on sitting in that meeting. I didn't plan on staying in New York this long, and I definitely didn't plan on feeling like this." The violinist fell silent. The air shifted. "I've built my life like a fortress," he continued. "Every decision, every deal, everything carefully measured. But meeting you, it wrecked the order I'd created, and I don't want to go back." She swallowed hard. "Soren." He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim leather folder. When she opened it, her heart stopped. A contract, her name, a title, a position: creative director, Beck Foundation. "You're giving me a job?" she asked, startled. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," he said, "but I've seen what you can do with scraps. I want to see what happens when you're given full control. A real budget, a real team, no politics, no one undermining you." She stared at the paper. "This is insane." "It's real," he said, "and it's yours if you want it." She stared at the words, her name, her dream, but then she looked up. Why now? He leaned forward, voice low. Because I want to build something with you, not just a project, a future. Tessa's pulse pounded. You're serious? I've never been more. She stood abruptly and walked to the railing. The wind tugged at her hair. The city glittered below like a promise. He joined her quietly. You don't have to decide tonight. I can't take a job from you just because we're, whatever this is. Then take it because you've earned it 100 times over, she turned to him. What if it doesn't work out, us, the job, all of it? Then we deal with it, he said. Together, her voice caught. No one's ever said that to me before. He stepped closer. Then let me be the first of many. She looked up at him, heart thundering. I want to believe you, then do, and when she kissed him, it wasn't soft, it was fierce, hungry. Like everything she'd been holding back finally broke free. Later, as they danced alone beneath the lanterns, Soren whispered, Let me take you away this weekend, just us, somewhere quiet. Tessa hesitated. I've never left on a whim before. Then it's time, she nodded slowly. Okay, pack light, he said. We'll be flying out Saturday morning, she blinked. Flying, he grinned. Jet's already on standby. 2 days later, Tessa stood barefoot on the deck of a private villa in St. Lucia, staring at turquoise waves that stretched past the horizon. The air smelled like salt and citrus. She could hear Soren downstairs, speaking French to the chef who'd arrived to prepare them breakfast. She wrapped the linen robe tighter around herself and stepped inside. The villa was a cathedral of glass and stone, perched high above the water. Everything felt unreal. Soren, she called. In the kitchen, he answered. She padded downstairs and found him barefoot, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He handed her one and kissed her temple. You okay? He asked. She nodded. Just overwhelmed. Good overwhelmed or bad? Both. He led her to a lounge chair and they sat together, legs tangled, sunlight warming their skin. I've been thinking, he said after a while, about what this really is. She turned to him slowly. I don't want this to be temporary, he said. Not the job, not this trip, not us, Soren. I know it's fast, I know we're still figuring things out, but I don't want to play it safe anymore. She looked at him, heart racing. What are you saying? I'm saying. He paused, then reached into the pocket of his shorts and pulled out a small velvet box her breath caught. I'm not asking you to marry me, he said quickly. Not yet, but I want you to hold on to this, because I know what I want, and when you're ready, I'll be waiting. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, not a diamond. A sapphire, deep and ocean dark, set in a band of twisted gold. Tessa stared, speechless. I chose it because it reminded me of your eyes, he said, the way they looked the first time you challenged the world. She touched the stone, stunned. This is a promise, he finished, that I see you, all of you. Tears filled her eyes. You really mean this? I've never meant anything more. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no, but she slipped the ring onto her finger. And the way he looked at her, then like she was the only thing that made sense in the world, told her that whatever came next, they were in it together. Tessa stepped onto the marble foyer of the Beck Foundation's newly renovated office, sunlight streaking through floor-to-ceiling windows and catching the glass sculpture suspended above the reception area. She barely recognized the space. It was bold, modern, open, transformed from the dull, gray cube farm she remembered into something alive, just like her life lately. Miss Vance, the team's ready for you in the West Conference room, said the assistant standing by the desk, eyes wide with admiration. Tessa gave a nod and headed down the hallway, heels clicking against polished stone. It had been 6 weeks since she'd stepped into this new role, and each day still felt like stepping into someone else's life. A life where she made decisions without needing approval. A life where ideas were greenlit instead of buried under red tape. A life where Soren was never far. Inside the conference room, her team was gathered around a wall-sized screen displaying their latest project. A cultural initiative pairing young digital artists with underserved communities. It was ambitious, unconventional, and risky, the kind of thing the old version of the foundation never would have touched. Let's do it, she said after reviewing their presentation. Secure the partnerships, lock in the launch date, make it big. The team didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Their nods were enough. They trusted her and she trusted them. After the meeting, Tessa made her way to the rooftop garden, a hidden sanctuary above the bustling city. She sat on a stone bench surrounded by lemon trees and lavender bushes, letting the breeze cool her skin. Her phone buzzed in her lap. "I heard the West team's ready to go," Soren said as he approached from behind, his voice low and unmistakable. "They are," she replied without turning. "You didn't even question the budget." "I didn't have to. I built it myself." He came around and sat beside her, his gaze steady. "You're not the same woman I met in that boardroom. I'm still her," she said, just louder. Soren brushed a hand over her knee, a quiet gesture of approval. "I like loud." She leaned in slightly. "You didn't come up here just to talk about work." "No." He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to her. "You've been invited to the Solstice Gala." Tessa's brows lifted as she opened it. "This is exclusive, only 200 people. All hand-picked. And I wasn't on that list last year. You weren't in my world last year." She glanced over the embossed text, then looked up. "Why now? Because someone's trying to pull you in." The words hung heavy. Tessa knew what he meant. The whispers had started weeks ago. Rumors that her relationship with Soren was the only reason she had the position, that she was a placeholder. A temporary indulgence, never mind the work she'd done or the results she'd delivered. The narrative had already formed. "Let them whisper," she said. "I won't give them anything to hold on to." Soren's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to defend yourself." "No," she agreed, "but I will." He hesitated. "There's something else." She turned to him, pulse quickening. "My father's flying in from Geneva." "He'll be at the gala." Tessa exhaled slowly. "You've never mentioned him before." "Because he's the reason I built everything the way I did. I spent my life trying to prove I could do it without him, without his money, without his name." "Does he know about me?" "He knows I'm seeing someone." "He doesn't know I'm serious about you." Tessa studied his expression, the flicker of unease behind his eyes. "What are you afraid of?" "That he'll see you and try to twist it. Make it look like I'm repeating his mistakes. He married someone for power, not love. He lost everything trying to keep both." "I'm not your father's mistake," she said softly. "I know," Soren replied, "but you're the first person I've ever wanted to protect from him." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then don't protect me from him. Stand beside me." His eyes locked onto hers. "I will." The night of the Solstice Gala arrived like a thunderstorm, ominous, electric, impossible to ignore. Tessa stepped out of the black car, her gown catching the wind, a deep sapphire that shimmered like oil under the lights. The event was held in the Winter Conservatory, a glass palace suspended over the river, filled with golden lights, strings of orchids, and the scent of white gardenias. Soren stepped from the car behind her, his tuxedo crisp, the cuffs of his shirt catching the light like polished bone. He offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. Inside, the crowd parted subtly as they entered. Heads turned, conversations paused. Tessa kept her spine straight, her expression unreadable. Near the center of the room stood a tall man in a navy suit, silver hair combed back, a flute of champagne in his hand. His eyes were sharp, calculating. Soren's grip on her arm tightened the slightest bit. "That's him," he murmured. Tessa felt his tension but didn't flinch. They approached together. "Soren," the man said, voice smooth as marble. "You look successful." "Father," Soren replied, nodding once. "This is Tessa Vance." The elder Beck turned to her, eyes sweeping over her once, then again. "Ah, the woman I've been hearing about." Tessa extended her hand. "It's a pleasure." "A pleasure for whom?" he asked, smiling like a knife. "Depends on who's asking," she said, not blinking. His smile faltered just for a second, then he laughed. "Well, at least you didn't bring another sycophant," Soren cut in, voice cool. "She's not here for your approval." "No," his father said. "She's here for mine." Tessa's heartbeat remained steady. "Actually, I'm here because I belong." The elder Beck looked at her, then at his son. "She has teeth, I'll give you that." Soren's hand slid to the small of her back. "She has everything." They walked away without waiting for another word. Inside the ballroom, the music swelled. Tessa let herself breathe again. "You didn't flinch," Soren said. "Was I supposed to?" He turned her toward the dance floor. "He's not used to being challenged." "Neither were you," she murmured as he pulled her close. "I like how wrong I was." They moved through the crowd like they belonged there, and maybe, just maybe, they did, but halfway through the second dance, Soren's phone buzzed in his pocket. He checked it and his expression shifted. "What is it?" she asked. "There's been a breach at the foundation," he said. "Someone leaked internal documents to a media outlet." Tessa's stomach dropped. "What kind of documents?" "Financials. Executive memos." "Maybe more." She stepped back, heart racing. "Do they mention me?" "Not by name," he said. "But the timing's deliberate." "Someone wants to destroy me." "No," he said. "They want to hurt me by going through you." "Then we fight," she said. "Because I'm not going anywhere." His eyes locked onto hers, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Around them the gala glittered on, oblivious. Then he said, "Let's find out who wants a war." And just like that, the night changed. The fairy tale shimmered into something sharper. Because love, real love, didn't just survive attacks, it answered them. The boardroom buzzed with a low, ominous hum as the leadership team filtered in, their eyes shadowed with unease. No one said it, but everyone knew something was unraveling. Tessa stood at the head of the table in a tailored black blouse and slate pencil skirt, face composed, hands flat against the lacquered surface. She didn't wait for silence. "We've identified the breach origin point," she said, voice clear. "It came from within." A restricted access folder was copied and transmitted through a company proxy server. The room stilled. No one asked who had access to that folder. They all knew. Across from her sat Gerald Langston, one of the senior advisors to the board. He was sipping espresso, unreadable. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, then darted away. Soren leaned against the wall behind her, arms folded, gaze fixed on Langston. Tessa tapped the tablet in front of her, turning the screen to face the table. The IP address was traced to a terminal in Langston's office. Gerald chuckled, low and dry. "You must be mistaken. I've been traveling for the past 2 weeks. My assistant has full access to my system." "Your assistant was in Barbados. We checked flight logs," Tessa said. Gerald's jaw tightened. "Why?" Soren asked, stepping forward. "What were you trying to accomplish?" Gerald set the cup down with a sharp click. "You brought her in without vetting, elevated her overnight. You undermine the structure that's held this foundation together for over a decade." "No," Soren said. "I replaced a system that protected mediocrity." Gerald stood slowly. "You don't understand the circles we move in. Perception matters more than truth. And the perception is that your new director is a liability." Tessa didn't flinch. "Then maybe it's time to change the circle." Gerald turned to her, face twisted. "You'll never belong. You were an intern. Now you're the face of a global initiative. No lineage, no legacy. Just a pretty story for the press." Soren's voice dropped to a dangerous calm. "Get out." Gerald looked like he wanted to argue, but the finality in Soren's tone stopped him. He straightened his jacket and walked out without another word. Silence fell. Tessa turned to the rest of the room. "I know some of you have doubts. I'm not going to convince you with speeches. I'll show you with results." Not a single person objected. Later, in Soren's penthouse, she stood barefoot at the window, watching the storm roll over the skyline. Her hair was undone, tumbling over her shoulders, and she held a glass of water she hadn't touched. "You okay?" Soren asked from behind her. "No," she said, "but I will be." He stepped closer, hands gentle on her waist. "You didn't deserve any of that." "I know," she whispered. "But it's not about what I deserve, it's about what I'm willing to fight for." He kissed her shoulder. "I've never seen anyone handle pressure like you did today." She turned to face him. "I was terrified. But losing what we're building would have been worse." He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "We can walk away, right now, leave the city, start over anywhere. You'd give all this up." "I'd give up anything that tried to poison what we have." Tessa drew in a shaky breath. "I don't want to run, I want to win." He smiled, something softer, less guarded. Then we win. The next morning, the headline broke. Internal sabotage foiled at Beck Foundation. Tessa Vance clears her name and doubles down on reform. The article included direct quotes from donors, board members, and even rival organizations, all praising her swift action and integrity. But the part that made her chest tighten was the last line. She may not come from wealth, but Miss Vance has something far rarer, undeniable vision. By noon, the foundation's inbox flooded with new partnership inquiries. That afternoon, Tessa stepped into the studio space she'd quietly commissioned on the top floor away from operations. Inside, daylight poured through angled skylights. Blank canvases lined one wall, paints and brushes waited, untouched. She stood still. Then she picked up a brush. She hadn't painted in years. Soren found her an hour later, barefoot, a streak of violet across her knuckle. She didn't hear him come in. "I thought I'd find you here," he said. She wiped her hand on a cloth. "I don't know what I'm doing." "You don't have to." He walked over, looked at the canvas. She'd started something abstract, bold, chaotic but vibrant. "It's beautiful," he said. She turned to him, eyes glossy. "I feel like I've been running uphill for so long. I forgot what stillness felt like." He reached into his coat, pulled out an envelope, and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a deed to a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights. Her name was on it. "I wanted to wait," he said. "But after everything, if we're going to build a life, I want a place that's ours. Somewhere we don't have to perform." She stared at the paper, stunned. "You bought a home. We'll renovate it together, make it what we want. But it's yours just as much as it's mine. I don't know what to say. Say you'll move in with me." She looked at him, the man who had watched her rise, who had stood beside her when it would have been easier to walk away. The man who gave her space to grow instead of trying to control her. "Yes," she said, "I'll move in with you." Later that night, they stood on the rooftop of the brownstone, construction still underway below them. The city stretched around them, the sky clear for the first time in days. Soren turned to her. "Do you remember what I told you the first night we had dinner? You said meeting me wrecked your order. And I meant it, but it also rebuilt something better." He reached into his pocket. This time it wasn't a promise ring, it was a diamond. Set in a platinum band that caught the moonlight. "I don't need more time to know," he said. "I don't need to wait for the world's approval. Tessa, will you marry me?" She didn't cry, she didn't hesitate. She said yes, and threw her arms around his neck. They kissed under the stars, the city humming around them, 1,000 windows glowing like quiet witnesses. In the weeks that followed, the Beck Foundation launched its most successful campaign in history. Tessa's programs expanded to 10 new cities. A major publication named her one of the most influential women in philanthropy. But that wasn't what stayed with her. What stayed were the mornings in the brownstone, wrapped in warm sheets. The quiet laughter over burnt pancakes. The nights spent painting in silence while Soren read across the room. The way he looked at her like nothing else had ever made sense until now. They married on the lawn of a vineyard in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by wildflowers and their closest friends. There was no press, no photographers. Just a string quartet, handwritten vows, and a promise made under the open sky. And when he carried her across the threshold of their home, she realized she hadn't just climbed the mountain. She had built her own, and at the top he was waiting. The scent of bergamot and white tea drifted through the hallway as Tessa adjusted her cufflinks, a new habit Soren had passed on to her. She'd never worn custom shirts before, much less ones that felt like silk and fit her like armor. But now, walking into the Beck Foundation's first annual Legacy Symposium, the flagship event she had built from the ground up in just under 7 months, she no longer felt like a woman trying to belong. She felt like a woman who had arrived. The ballroom at the Metropolitan Museum had been transformed into a living archive of modern impact. Curated installations glowed in soft amber lighting, showcasing community art, interactive data walls, and immersive storytelling booths where attendees could experience funded projects firsthand. She'd insisted on breaking the mold, and the result was nothing short of breathtaking. "Tessa," said Maureen Delacroix, editor-in-chief of the Global Gallery and one of the keynote panelists. "This is the most compelling philanthropic showcase I've seen in 20 years. You've made something unforgettable." "Thank you," Tessa replied, her voice steady. "The team gave everything, I just held the vision." Maureen lowered her voice. "Your name's coming up in rooms you don't even know exist. There's talk of the UN summit." Tessa blinked. "That's unexpected." "It shouldn't be." Maureen touched her arm. "Keep going, don't let this be your peak." As Maureen disappeared into the crowd, Soren appeared behind her with a glass of sparkling elderflower water. "You haven't eaten, I checked. I'm not hungry." "You've said that 3 times today." "You know I keep track." She took the glass and sipped it. "What if I can't duplicate this next year?" He tilted his head. "You didn't duplicate anything to get here, you invented it. Why start copying now?" She leaned slightly into him. "I'm still learning to believe I belong in rooms like this." "You don't belong in rooms like this," he said, her brows lifted. "You own them." She laughed softly. "You always say exactly what I need to hear." "I say what's true." He stepped back just enough to let her lead the next part of the evening, her address to nearly 300 guests, no cue cards, no teleprompter. Just her, under the lights, speaking from the core of everything she had lived through. When she finished, the standing ovation came not in a burst, but in a wave, slow, powerful, undeniable. Later, as the evening wound to a close, she slipped out to the museum's rooftop garden, needing a breath. The city stretched below, every building lit like a candle in a cathedral. Her heels echoed against the stone as she moved toward the edge, the wind tugging at the hem of her dress. "You don't disappear from your own event unless you want me to chase you," Soren's voice called from behind her. "I needed air," he joined her at the ledge. "Do you know what I see when I look at you right now? I hope it's not exhaustion. I see a woman who rewrote every narrative handed to her." She turned to face him fully. "I didn't do it alone." "No, you didn't." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim velvet box, not small like before, longer. He held it out. "I know we already said forever. I know you wear my ring and live in my home and speak my name like it's your second breath. But I want this to be official. I want to see you walk toward me in a dress that makes the whole world stop, and I want to say vows that we already live every day." She opened the box. Inside rested a bracelet of gold and diamond filigree, delicate vines curling into the shape of their initials. At the center, a tiny charm, a compass rose. "I want to marry you, Tessa Vance, not someday, soon. While the flowers are still blooming and the world still remembers this night as the moment everything changed." Her throat tightened. "You're proposing with a bracelet. You already have the ring," he said. "This is for your other wrist, a reminder that no matter where you go, I'll find you. And we'll always find our way back." She slipped it on without hesitation, then kissed him with the kind of certainty that didn't need words. They married 3 weeks later, not in the city, not in a vineyard or a ballroom, but in a greenhouse outside Florence, where the walls were glass and the ceiling was wildflowers. Only 20 guests. No press. Just music, laughter, and the kind of love that made time feel irrelevant. Tessa wore a simple ivory gown with a neckline that framed her collarbones like sculpture. Soren wore a suit the exact shade of storm clouds, no tie, barefoot on the stone aisle. Their vows were spoken in whispers, but they echoed louder than any speech she'd ever given. Afterward, they danced beneath strings of lights and scattered petals, the air scented with olive trees and lemon blossoms. The honeymoon was unplanned. They wandered Italy with no itinerary, no destination, waking in towns they couldn't pronounce and falling asleep in villas with no names. Tessa painted again, sometimes on napkins, sometimes on the backs of maps. Soren wrote notes in the margins of his novels, little messages she'd later find tucked between pages. They returned not to chaos, but to calm. The Beck Foundation continued to expand, but Soren stepped back from public leadership, choosing to mentor from behind the scenes. Tessa's influence grew globally, her programs implemented in over 30 countries, her face appearing on the cover of magazines she used to dream about reading. But at home, they were just themselves. They hosted dinners in the brownstone sunroom where artists, writers, and thinkers gathered. They adopted a dog who refused to walk in straight lines. They fought sometimes about trivial things like architecture or the best way to organize a bookshelf, but they never went to bed angry. On their first anniversary, Soren handed her a letter instead of a gift. Inside, he'd written, "I built empires before you, but none of them felt like home. Now, every time I walk through the door and you're there even in silence, even with paint on your cheek, I don't feel like I'm arriving somewhere. I feel like I never left." She didn't say anything in response. She just kissed him, slow and deep, and then dragged him back into the house where the windows were open and the music was low, and the world outside could wait just a little longer. Because in the end, it wasn't the money, the power, or the legacy that mattered. It was the way he looked at her when the room emptied. It was the way she reached for his hand without thinking. It was the life they built, unexpected, imperfect, but entirely theirs.